Our story starts with Tony Frank. Tony was Unicord's amp guru from the late 60s through the 70s. Through a long and convoluted series of corporate buyouts and mergers that have no business being discussed in a video about guitar amps, Unicord, a transformer manufacturer, became the distributor for Marshall amps in the United States around 1968. But there was a catch. The transformers Marshall amps came into the US with weren't considered up to snuff for the 6550 tubes they were being shipped with, so Unicord came up with a simple solution. They happened to know a company willing to supply a few thousand high-end transformers to beef up these early Marshall plexi heads. Unicord. This is where Tony and his brother Kenny come into the picture. They, being the amp experts in town, namely Westbury, New York, were tasked with getting to know the amps, converting their transformers to the new Unicord units, and fixing and modifying any heads that came back to the warehouse with problems. For most small-time bar band guitarists, these plexis were more than they'd ever need. But for touring guitarists who needed more volume and could throw their name around, the Frank brothers became their go-to modders. Tony was known to work on amps used by the likes of Jimmy Page, Jimi Hendrix, Ted Nugent, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Peter Frampton, Jeff Lynne, Mick Jones, Eddie Van Halen, Greg Allman, and Al Di Meola. The exact mods he performed aren't clear, but speculation ranges from simple internal jumper switches to full-on hot rod rebuilds that increased the power amp output by more than 30%. That's no small feat in those days. One thing is for certain, though. By 1971, Tony had created the very first Marshall-style master volume circuit, which would go on to be the foundation for the beloved 2203 and 2204 Marshall heads, and a standard feature on many amps today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's set the clock back to 1968. Unicord is making money hand over fist bringing Marshall amps into the US and swapping in their beefed-up transformers. But, like most corporations within corporations, their execs saw dollar signs and decided to cut out the middleman. Why ship Marshall stacks all the way across the Atlantic when they had their very own circuit wizard conjuring up the greatest sounds New York had ever heard? They approached Tony and Kenny and asked them to design their own competition to the Marshall that could be added to the Univox amplifier lineup. Namely, 60-watt and 100-watt basement-inspired amp stacks. Univox already had a number of small and inexpensive combos to pair with their unique takes on popular guitars of the day, but now they wanted something new, amps to compete for professional guitarists' cash. How would they beat the cheap junk allegations? They'd leverage the Frank brothers' connections to famous rock stars and set up huge stacks of their new blue amplifiers behind them on stage. Univox B and C group users include Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, Jeff Beck, the Chambers Brothers, and the Doors. Most used the UX501 Fat Albert head and 612 six-pack cab. But there was trouble in paradise. To quote John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin in a 1977 interview, "I've used everything from a lousy made-up job to a great huge top valve amp. Then we met the guy from Univox, and he came up with the bass stack, which unfortunately didn't last the night. But while it was going, it was the most unbelievable sound I'd ever heard. It was at the Nassau Coliseum in New York, I remember, and the bass filled the hall. It was so big, it couldn't have lasted. I don't think I'll come across anything that sounded like that again. But, as I said, 3 numbers and wheel the acoustics out again." The Fat Albert may have been the most powerful and feature-rich stack of the early 70s, but ironically, the Unicord transformers simply couldn't handle the power, and were reported to literally go up in smoke and on some occasions, even shoot flames out of the amp mid-set. The Univox amps we're discussing can be broken into one of two eras. The earlier Proto group amps debuted around 1968 and stayed in their lineup until early 1971. These were clad in black and aluminum and used the box and ball Univox logo. They typically have dual channels running into a 2 or 3 band EQ, and higher-end examples include a presence knob. Guitar heads included reverb and tremolo, while bass heads lack any effects. Both were sold with either 1 or 2 2x12 cabinets. There was also the 4-channel 1075 PA amp, which could be bought with a matching 2x15 cab with 6 tweeters. Like many amp companies and car manufacturers of the time, their numbers were made up and the values didn't matter. 60-watt amps with 2 6L6 GCs were generally listed as 100-watt, and 100-watt amps with 4 6L6 GCs were listed as 200-watt. Tube amps are usually referred to by their RMS wattage, a sort of average output power that an amp can put out and a speaker is able to handle day after day. By listing their peak wattage, Univox wasn't technically lying and could make their amps seem twice as powerful as the competition. This number fudging has been the bane of many Craigslist treasure hunters like myself, as people who sell the amps for cheap just list the technically not incorrect wattage off the back of the amplifier, which can make IDing an amp in a post titled Old Tube Amp really difficult. Either way, these amps sold well enough that Univox decided that they needed a lineup refresh that would debut in 1971. Enter the group amplifiers. The A group were mostly further iterations of the transistor combos of the Proto group, so I'll skip right over them. The B group were also further iterations and improvements of the tube stacks from the Proto group, but with one major difference. They looked cool as hell. Gone were the now dated, automotive-inspired, square aluminum faceplates. Gone were the conservative-looking square shapes and sharp 90-degree angles. The new round and routed fascia, striped grill cloth, flashy new logo, and heavy-duty corners and handles made this lineup look like props out of a psychedelic sci-fi movie. This group came in two colorways. A simple black and gray, so as not to offend the more traditional guitar players, and a combo of dark blue, light blue, orange, and red that could have only debuted in the acid-soaked early 70s. Internally, these amps tend to be similar to the Proto group with some minor tweaking and readjustments of the schematic. Univox also standardized the series by making all of the B group amplifiers 2-channel, 4-input layouts with middle, treble, bass, and presence EQs, and either 2 or 4 6L6 GC power tubes. Guitar stacks came with reverb and trem, and bass and PA stacks did not, although the PA stacks now came with effects loops. You could also get the stacks in either 100-watt 2x12 or 60-watt 4x10 combos now, while the heads were paired with newly ported 2x12 cabinets. There was also the C group, which contained exactly one amplifier. The UX501 Fat Albert 140-watt head, paired with either a 412, a 612, or a 2x15 folded horn cab for either guitar or bass use. The feature list for the Fat Albert is truly mind-blowing, boasting features that wouldn't be seen in Marshalls or Fenders until the late 70s and early 80s. This amp was clearly Tony Frank's wet dream, an amalgamation of all the mods he'd been doing for rock stars for the last few years, in an amp of his own design. First, we have the tunneling circuit, an internal jumper switch that can be used to run both channels into the power amp simultaneously. This gives you more gain and allows you to shape your tone by blending the bass and bright channels before they hit the EQ. Next, we have a switchable high boost, which is presumably a cathode bypass cap, that adds more treble content and some gain to the high channel. There are a pair of line-in jacks that allow you to bypass the pre's and chain multiple 1501s together directly into the power amp. And finally, and most importantly, the UX1501 Fat Albert is one of the very first production guitar amps to come with a factory master volume circuit, something that Marshall wouldn't do for another 4 years until the release of the 2203 and 2204 heads, with no credit given to the Frank brothers. This amp ran 4 6550 output tubes into 4 speaker outs at an ear-shattering and transformer-melting 140 watts RMS. This caused the now rare amp to shine like the sun for a few glorious moments until they burned up and splattered on the ground. Public opinion on these amps is divisive. Some people absolutely love the sound and can't get enough, while others can't stand them and think their only value is using the gutted chassis for another JTM 45 clone. I'll let you decide. Here's my 1971 U1226 head and U1205 cab, aka the U1225 60-watt stack. According to blues lawyer lore, in the depths of some ancient forums, the porting on these cabs is accidentally perfect from an acoustic science perspective. In my experience, the cabs sound great for guitar, but really shine for bass. I agree with John Paul Jones that they seem to fill the room while staying smooth and warm like no other amp I've ever heard. Some complain that they have too much treble, but that's what the super responsive EQ knobs are there for. Thanks for listening, and if you liked what you just heard, subscribe to see my next installment in this series where I find out exactly when and where Jimmy Page used his 1501 on stage.